Okay, the last time I talked about the Senate as being our most important governing institution, and that's because that's how the states act as a union to make, with the full power to make decisions like levying war, concluding peace, contracting alliances, establishing commerce, and to do all other acts and things that an independent state may by right do. Okay, so what we had was at the end of the Declaration of Independence, when it was published to declare their independence, that's what each state was declaring their independence for. And if you look at the last paragraph, what it says is that each state, by right of independent states with a S, were by right do. Okay, and they weren't a union at that time. Yes, they were the United States and General Congress assembled, but they weren't a union. Okay, and to make those decisions collectively as a union, they needed to assemble and have some way of governing and how to participate. The states would participate in those decision making, and also how they would come to a majority consensus on what to do. And that's where democracy comes into place, because in a democracy, all the states are assembled as equals with equal suffrage to make those decisions of a free and independent state collectively. And that's what governs how they make the decisions. So there's a process for how to put a question. Then you have to deliberate the question. Then you determine the question. So, and if you look at the rules for the Senate that they agreed to when in our first Congress under the United States Constitution, or the Constitution of the United States, let's put it the right way. It means something different when you say it the other way. That's exactly what they do. They said in order to put a question, you have to have somebody raise a question and then somebody second it. You know, raise a motion and then somebody seconds the motion. That's kind of situation you have here. And then you have to have a quorum to deliberate or to consider the question. And what they're doing there is they're considering the cost-benefit relationship of any action that they might take. And that's not just monetary actions. If you go to war, there's a cost-benefit relationship that's involved in that declaration of war with the people. You know, you whatever you do is going to cost you something, and you have to be able to realize the benefit from whatever your investment is in that altercation. So, and then once you've deliberated and have your cost-benefit relationship, then you determine the question. And to determine the question, you have to have a majority of 9 of 13 states at the time when they first Congress. Okay. which was the same for under the Articles of Confederation at the time. And they did change it to 2/3 of the states instead of 9 or 13 states, because given the expectation that they would add more states, they couldn't base everything on 9 or 13 states. They had to have a percentage that they needed for concurrence. Okay, so that's the most important, is because that democracy determines how we act as a union, and everything in government is a decision on how to act as a government, as a union. There are no other decisions that can be made. So the Senate is where those decisions are made, how to act as the union. And every state has the right to equality of participation in those decisions. That's how they formed the union. They wanted a democracy. All the states are assembled as equals with equal suffrage. But democracy has a defect. And that defect is, it's fine for making decisions on how to act, but it's a different story for the other also important parts of the decision making, or the participation versus compliance agreement, which is what the Constitution is, because that establishes the benefits and the privileges, the rights of participation in decision making, which they determine to be a democracy, and cost. And when you look at all those things, especially the rights of participation in decision making for those definition of those benefits and privileges and the cost, you need to be able to have a more equitable decision making system, to where the size and wealth and other disparities that there were between the states could be accounted for in making those decisions. And that's where a Republican form of government comes into play, and why the House of Representatives is our most important assembly, legislative assembly. Okay? The Senate is our most important legislative institution. The House is the most important legislative assembly. Why? Because they had to normalize the states based on a common factor in order to truly join them as equals. And what's that common factor? The common factor is each state's population as a percentage of the whole population of the union, okay, of all the states together. That's a common factor. How many people reside in their state? Okay, and what that does is it gives them proportional representation to participate in the discussion, and it gives them proportional suffrage in order to determine those decisions of how the states interact with each other to actually form the union and actually operate the union. Okay, there's a difference between operating the union and acting as the union. The bicameral Republican form of government established by Article 1 assembles and operates the government. The unicameral democracy of the states, which is reestablished by Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution of the United States, is how it acts as the union and how they form administration and for the general affairs, to manage the general affairs of the union. Okay, that's different. You've got the operation on one side and the actions on the other. Okay. So, how do you do proportional legislative process? Well, the way that they chose was a Republican form of government in a bicameral legislature, where the states would be assembled proportionally by their number of persons that lived in their state, by their population, and then to determine the cost-benefit relationships, and identify and rank choices and determine what choice that they wanted to make on that cost-benefit curve. The Senate then would be the democracy again to balance that iterative system. So you have one that identifies and ranks the choices and makes a choice. And then you have another one for concurrence on that choice. So you have 9 states today in the House that can determine how they want or where they want to operate on any cost-benefit relationship. Okay, and they get to make the choice of how the scope and cost of every common or collective service or that they have between the states that each state participates in equally. Okay, and then you have on the other side, you have 41 states in the House that have to concur with that determination. And okay, so 9 states decided where they wanted to operate on the curve. And then when they sent it to the Senate for concurrence, there are 41 states to reject that because it doesn't fit the economics for their state, or it doesn't it's not, it may disadvantage their state or disenfranchise their state in some way. And so these are the considerations that, especially if it costs money. If it costs money, they've already agreed to how to pay the debts of the nation, how to apportion it. Because along with the proportional representation in the House to participate in those decisions, they also tied the taxes assessed on each state to that same apportionment for equity, so that it's all per capita. So each state is paying exactly the same amount per capita. And I don't want to, get into the mathematics of that if people don't understand what per capita equality is. But before they were determining the apportionment of taxes based on the different forms of property within each state. They changed that to the same per capita apportionment based on the enumeration that they have to participate in making those decisions. And that's why it's equitable. So what they did was they balanced the legislative process by adding the proportional branch of the legislature to the process. So it's an iterative process. So it's balanced. So that's where checks and balances come from. That's how they establish checks and balances. It's legislative. It's a balance between the power of the large states to determine the scope and cost, and the small states to determine concurrence. So you have balanced the powers of the large and small states. That's the balance of power, checks and balances. And they each a check on each other. And the reality is that the Senate has an additional check on it, which is the state legislature, their own state legislature, which directs and controls how they vote for concurrence on those matters. So it's checked on one side and doubly checked on the other. Okay, so the Senate is a check for the House. The House is a check for the Senate, and the state legislature is a check for the Senate too. So that the Senate really, they have to follow their state's direction in their vote for concurrence. Because if let's take a state like Colorado, which only has like I think 5.5 million people, so their proportion of expenditures is low, because 5.5 million out of 340 million is very low, couple of percent. So when they form their own state's collective revenue, they tax for property, commerce, and consumption within their own state to cover the expenditures of their own state, the collective services of their own state. And then they have to cover collective their part of all the collective expenditures that they make out of the in the federal government. So their consideration is: do we have to raise more taxes as collective revenue in our state to cover the expenditures that they are under consideration? And if it's more money than they can afford, then the answer is no. Okay? And Colorado could set in their own constitution what the percentage of the state's collective revenue that they can use to pay their part of the federal collective taxes. Okay, their proportion of the by direct tax of expenditures that they vote for. And if it exceeds that percentage of, like say 10% of per annum of state collective revenue. That's what Colorado wants to budget for federal cost. Then Colorado's answer is no. If their part of the added expenditure exceeds that 10%. Okay? And that's all the expenditures they have too. It's not just that one. It's all the federal expenditures that they have to pay for. If there's a part that exceeds it, then it's because they would have to go back to the state legislature in order to get approval to exceed that 10%. Okay? This is how government is supposed to work. This is how you control costs and government spending. The whole thing is that the states have to approve the expenditures and the cost that they're expected to, that they're required to pay, because they've already agreed to pay their proportion of that expenditure. And that determines their vote, yes or no. So if they say no, then what happens is it goes back to the House. And they have to pick a new point, because when it goes back to the House, when the states and the Senate send it back to the House, they'll send it back to the House for reconsideration along with some amendments to advise those 9 larger states what would be necessary to gain the concurrence of the 41 smaller states. Okay, because they need a majority of the states. A majority is a simple majority consensus of the states, which would be 26 states in the Senate must. So that's 52 votes, 26 states, not 51 votes. No. And that goes back to something in the Senate. In order to form a quorum, you have to have both your senators present. And the state has equal suffrage, not the individual senator. So each senator has basically half of the state's suffrage. So, you can't have fractional states for a percentage. So it can't be 51. You have to have 52 in order to form a majority. Majority isn't 51 votes. But this is how it plays. Okay, the states consider what the best point of operation is on the curve and how much it costs. They send it to the Senate for concurrence to determine whether or not the states want to pay that, choose that point because of how it fits in their economics. If it doesn't, they send it back, and they try to. And this is the process that they need to go through, iteration process, in order to come up with a point of operation that suits both the large and small states. Okay, not just the large states and not just the small states. Whereas under the Articles of Confederation, it was the small states that drove that bus. Okay, they decided. But let's get back to proportional. How do you determine proportionality? Well, I just told you that each state is apportioned representation in the House based on their proportion of the population, based on enumeration. That's a percentage that they are entitled to in both representation and suffrage. And suffrage is power. That's where the idea of a vote being power comes from. is they have the power of their vote to reach a majority consensus for assent to any measure. Okay? So that's where it comes from. That's power. That's how the power is determined. Power in the Senate is equal. Each state has one vote. That's power. And no, you can't consolidate that power to control. No. That's the state's residual sovereignty. Is that vote. Equal vote to reach a majority consensus. Okay? So now I'm going to have to take you back to, for me it was the third grade, but I've looked up on the internet and found out that most people don't do ratios, proportions, and percents until the seventh grade. Okay? But how do you change the percentage into a whole number of representatives? Okay? How do you do it? Can I do it by fixing the number of seats in the House? No. So how do you do it? Well, you divide the let me approach this a different way. I have 10 people that have a number of marbles each, okay? And I have a big jar of marbles, and I'm going to give each of them a portion of that large jar of marbles based on their percentage in the small jar of our marbles. Okay? I calculate each one's percent, multiply by the number of large marbles there are, and that's how many marbles each one of them gets. Okay? What happens to the other marbles that were calculated that are fractional marbles? Who gets those? You can't, if you give those marbles to, how do you make the determination of who to give it to? Because what happens is you screw up the percentage when you do that. Okay? So when they say whole number of representatives, they have to convert that percentage that each state of the population that each state has that were determined by the enumeration into a whole number of representatives. And there's only one way to do that, and that's with a proportionality constant. And when you divide the population by the proportionality constant, you calculate a fractional representative. So you need to understand what to do about those fractional representatives, and how do you deal with those? Well, you have to have boundary conditions. So the first boundary condition is not to exceed the proportionality constant, which is, in this case, 1 for 30,000. One representative for 30,000 people is a proportionality constant. Which means that you have to truncate any fractional representatives because they will exceed the proportionality constant if you try to round up to the next whole representative, just like the marbles. But what if a state doesn't have 30,000 people? they have a population less than 30,000 people. Well, that's where the second boundary condition comes in. Because if they have less than 30,000 people, which will only calculate a fractional representative, then that state is entitled to one representative. Okay? And then after you finish calculating the whole number of representatives each state is entitled, then you have to determine what the fraction of those representatives, the whole number each state is entitled as a proportion of the whole number of representatives, the aggregate whole number of representatives. Okay? And it has to be the same as the percentage you calculated with the enumeration, that they are entitled to representation in the House. That's why you have to use a proportionality constant. Okay? And if you think about it, you can't even do what they're trying to do today with 435. Number one, 1 for 30,000 is a constant, proportionality constant. It's not a maximum. It's not, every state's entitled to one. No. Every state is entitled to the whole number that based on their percentage. They're not entitled to one. Only a state that has less than 30,000 is entitled to one. Okay? So, forget for a second where they even found a number like 435 that, or justify the significance of 435. Let's forget that argument for now. But in order to do the apportionment right, they'd have to multiply 435 times the percentage that was calculated by the enumeration. And that's how many representatives each state would be entitled. Okay? Then you have how many of those 435 that are left over because they're all fractional. So some states wouldn't get any marbles, any representatives, because they only have a fractional portion of those 435. So then what are you going to do? Well, each state is entitled to one, so you have to round those up to one. Okay? All those who don't have a representative. But if you round them up, then by right, you should round up the other states too. Because you can't deny them a whole. Why would you do that? So that automatically, either way, even if you don't round up the other states who don't have only a fractional representative, you're still going to be over 435. Okay? A lot more than 435. So you can't get to 435 because you have to use a proportionality constant, and you have to have some way of dealing with the fractional representative in order, because that fractional representative is your error in the calculation. And you get to a point where when you determine area, and I know I'm a scientist and math person, but most people aren't. You can look at a curve and do something like the area under a curve and use something like a numerical method like the Simpson's rule or trapezoidal rule or something like that in order to calculate the area under the curve. But if you want to calculate it exactly, how do you do it? Well, you either have to make a whole bunch of little divisions in order to make sure that the error that in the calculation is minimized, and that's where you get integration, because it's a limit as x approaches 0, so that the space between each box gets closer to 0, and then it'll match the curve exactly. Well, you're doing the same thing here with this representation. If you don't have enough, then you have a lot of error. In fact, you have so much error that the error can be hundreds of times bigger than, your error is so big, you can be more than half of the. It could be larger than the number that you calculate. Okay, and that's what we're doing today. But so we have to calculate it right. And that's why I'm saying it's the most important legislative assembly. Because in order for the people, all the people, to participate equally in their government, they have to be represented in that representation that's formed in the House. And if they're not, then they're not participating, because you participate in the legislative assembly through your state. And your state's required to do the same thing in their state legislature, using their own representative density to minimize the error in the representation that they make of their population. And it's a demographic representation. You are not representing political affiliation or ideological affiliations. You're representing the people. And that's a demographic representation. That's not a party. We're not assembling based on party affiliation. We're assembling the people, all the people. And that's why it's the most it's the most important assembly, because all the people, in order to participate in a democratic process, which is still a democratic process even though it's a Republican form of government, you have to have all the people participate as equals. The rich, just like the poor. There's no advantage given to having money. That's why it can't be done in a competitive process to assemble the most numerous legislative branch. It has to be assembled strictly on forming a representation of all the people, so that all the people may participate as equals in the legislative process, as if they were there in person themselves to participate in the legislative process, and with equal suffrage to vote to determine the question. Okay, we're all supposed to have equal participation and equal suffrage in the legislative assembly. That's what Republican government is all about. I don't know what these people, we can't do a democracy based on party affiliation. Okay? No. And I'm going to end it there, so hopefully it uploads better than the last one, and it's already 40 minutes. But if we can't get that much right for how to assemble the House, both in the state and in the federal legislatures, then we've lost already, because everything else in our government is based on that assembly in order for it to operate properly, to make the decisions in the Senate on how to act. The people have to determine how their senators will vote for concurrence on how to act. That's what it means by saying it has a due dependence on and a due responsibility to all the people, is that we have to, together, collectively, the people in their collective capacity have to determine how we will act through our senators. Okay? As a union, this is collective government. There are no leaders, no lawmakers. We must be all the people. And that's women, children, not just voters. All the people. Rich, poor, black, white, man, woman, child. Doesn't matter. If you are a citizen of a state, then you have a right to participate in the legislative process in your state. Okay? To determine what? How your state acts as a state on both the state and federal level. This is what it's all about. That's Republican government. I don't know what people get the idea that you can elect a couple of people and somehow you're going to represent a majority of all the people with 435 representatives in the House. Get real. Thank you.